You know what's wild? Every generation gets its moment. Boomers had Woodstock and the Summer of Love. Millennials got their participation trophies and avocado toast think pieces. Gen Z is out here redefining gender and making TikToks about their therapy breakthroughs. But there's this entire generation that grew up in a psychological void so profound that most people don't even realize it shaped everything about how they operate. Generation X, born roughly 1965 to 1980. And here's the thing nobody talks about. They were raised without validation, not just a little less validation than other generations. I mean fundamentally, structurally, almost completely absent validation. And that absence created a psychological profile so distinct, so different from what came before or after, that it's actually shocking we don't study it more. Let me paint you a picture of what childhood looked like for them. You're 7 years old. It's 1979. You spend 3 hours building an elaborate Lego spaceship. You're proud, you run to show your parents. Your dad glances up from the newspaper for maybe 2 seconds, says that's nice and goes back to reading. Your mom's on the phone, waves you away, that's it. No photos, no praise, no calling grandma to brag, no posting it anywhere because the internet doesn't exist. You just got dismissed. And this wasn't neglect in the traditional sense. This was normal, expected. Kids weren't the center of the universe. They were just there, you did your thing, adults did theirs, the orbits rarely intersected, report cards came home, straight A's, that's what you're supposed to get. You didn't get celebrated for meeting expectations. You got noticed when you failed. Bring home a C, now there's a conversation. But it's not supportive, it's punitive. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you trying harder? Fix it. No exploration of learning styles or emotional blocks. Just fix it. By yourself, figure it out. Youth sports were the same way. You played soccer or little league and your parents might show up, might not. They weren't filming every second, weren't screaming at refs, weren't treating every game like a college scholarship audition. You played, you won or lost, life moved on. And if you did something exceptional, scored the winning goal, hit a home run, you might get a good job on the car ride home. Might, more likely, silence. Because acknowledging achievement felt like bragging, and bragging was the worst possible thing you could do. This created something psychologists call an internal locus of validation. Gen X learned early that external approval was unreliable, inconsistent, mostly absent, so they stopped looking for it. They developed internal metrics for success. Did I do this well? Do I feel good about this? That became the measuring stick, not because it was healthy or ideal, but because it was survival. When nobody's clapping, you either learn to clap for yourself quietly, internally, or you crumble. Most of them learn to clap for themselves. But here's the cost. That internal validation system is fragile. It's powerful, sure, makes you independent, but it also means you never quite believe praise when it comes. Someone compliments your work. Your brain immediately goes to, what do they want? What's the angle? Because unconditional positive regard wasn't part of your programming. Compliments always felt transactional or obligatory, never genuine. So even now, decades later, when someone says you did a great job, there's this automatic skepticism. This inability to just receive it and feel good. Now contrast this with how they're raising their own kids. Gen X became parents and swung hard in the opposite direction. They gave their children constant affirmation. You're special. You're amazing. Great job. I'm so proud of you. Every drawing went on the fridge. Every recital got applause. Every participation got a trophy because they remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to achieve something real and have nobody notice. They didn't want that for their kids. But here's the psychological whiplash. They're giving something they never received, and sometimes you can see it in their eyes, this confusion, this discomfort. They're telling their kid you're incredible for the 15th time that day, and some part of them is thinking, I did twice this much and nobody said a word. It's not resentment exactly, it's more like cultural vertigo, operating in a parenting paradigm that feels completely alien to their own experience. At work, this plays out in fascinating ways. Gen X doesn't need praise to function. In fact, too much praise makes them uncomfortable, suspicious. A boss who's constantly affirming and validating feels fake to them, manipulative. They'd rather have a boss who leaves them alone, lets them work, and only speaks up when there's a problem to solve. Feedback for Gen X is best delivered straight. No sandwich method, no softening the blow. Just tell them what's wrong. They'll fix it. They don't need their hand held, don't need reassurance that they're still valued. Just give them the information and get out of the way. This makes them incredible in high-pressure environments. When everything's on fire and there's no time for feelings, Gen X thrives. They don't need a pep talk. don't need someone to process emotions with them. They just need to know what the problem is. Then they solve it, quietly, efficiently, without needing anyone to watch or acknowledge the effort. But in normal, everyday environments, this can make them seem cold, detached, unemotional. Younger coworkers who grew up with constant feedback and validation find them intimidating. Why don't they ever say good job? Why don't they acknowledge effort? And the answer is simple, because nobody did that for them and they turned out fine. In their mind, you don't need it either. Toughen up, do the work, move on. Romantic relationships get complicated for the same reasons. Intimacy requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires believing that exposing your soft underbelly won't get you destroyed. But Gen X learned early that showing need, showing weakness, showing that you cared too much about something that was dangerous. People didn't respond with support. They responded with indifference or mockery. So they built walls, thick ones. They'll be loyal, they'll show up, they'll do things for you. Acts of service are their love language because actions are concrete, reliable, but asking them to verbalize feelings. To seek reassurance, to admit they need validation, that's like asking them to speak a language they never learned. It doesn't come naturally, it feels performative, fake. Many of them ended up in therapy later in life, and the therapist says you need to learn to ask for what you need. And they're sitting there thinking, I've never needed anything from anyone. That's the whole point. That's my strength. Except it's not just strength, it's also armor. And armor keeps things out, but it also keeps you locked in. Here's another layer. Gen X grew up in an era where feelings weren't discussed. You didn't talk about being sad or anxious or scared. You certainly didn't have a diagnosis for every emotional state. You just dealt with it, kept moving. And if you couldn't keep moving, if you actually broke down, that was shameful, weak, something to hide. Mental health wasn't a conversation, it was a stigma, so they learned to compartmentalize. To shove things down, to function regardless of what was happening internally. And they got really good at it, scarily good. You can be sitting across from a Gen Xer who's falling apart inside and you'd never know. They've mastered the mask, the everything's fine performance. Because showing cracks meant nobody was coming to help anyway. You'd just be exposed and still alone. Might as well keep the armor on. The internet era has been particularly weird for them. They built it, literally. The architects of the digital age are overwhelmingly Gen X, but they don't use it the way younger generations do. They don't post their feelings, don't share their struggles, don't crowdsource validation. Because the idea of putting yourself out there like that, of saying, here I am, please tell me I matter, that feels pathetic to them. Desperate. If you need that much external affirmation, something's wrong with you. At least that's the internal script. So they lurk, they observe, they participate minimally. And when they do post, it's ironic, detached, a meme, a sarcastic comment, never earnest, never vulnerable, because earnestness got you nothing as a kid except disappointment. Let's talk about achievement. Gen X achieves a lot, but they don't talk about it. Humble bragging feels gross to them. Regular bragging is unthinkable. They were raised in an era where talking about your accomplishments was considered tacky, arrogant. You were supposed to let your work speak for itself. So they do incredible things, and then they just don't mention it. They got a promotion, published something, built something meaningful, and unless you directly ask, you might never know. This drives younger generations crazy. Why don't you advocate for yourself? Why don't you make sure people know what you've done? And Gen X just shrugs. If it matters, people will notice. If they don't notice, it didn't matter. Either way, seeking recognition feels needy. Here's what's fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Research shows that children who grow up without consistent validation develop one of two patterns. Either they become approval-seeking, constantly chasing external validation to fill that void, or they become approval avoidant, rejecting the whole system and building internal metrics. Gen X largely went the second route. They didn't become approval-seeking because approval was so rare that chasing it felt futile. Instead, they rejected the premise. Built their own scorecards. Decided external validation was overrated anyway, and in many ways this made them resilient, independent, capable, but it also left scars, deep ones, because humans are social creatures. We're wired for connection, for recognition, for mattering to other people. And when you spend your formative years learning that you don't matter, at least not enough to be noticed, that shapes everything. They're the generation that gets things done without needing credit. That shows up without needing thanks. That survives without needing support. And that's powerful, admirable even, but it's also lonely, exhausting, because everyone needs validation sometimes. Everyone needs to hear that they matter, that their effort counts, that someone sees them. Gen X just never learned how to ask for it, so they don't. They keep moving, keep working, keep surviving, expecting nothing, getting less, and calling that strength.